April 23, 1944. Rechlin Air Base, Mecklenburg-Pomerania, Germany. Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lerche advanced the throttle of the massive American fighter to maximum power. The 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2 1800 roared with a deep mechanical thunder utterly unlike any German engine he had flown. Through the plexiglass canopy, he could see the yellow identification paint hastily applied to prevent German anti-aircraft gunners from shooting down their own evaluation aircraft. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, serial number 42-22490, designated T9+FK by the Luftwaffe Testing Command, rolled forward on the grass field. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lerche had test-flown over 100 different aircraft types by this point in the war, without ever crashing or seriously damaging a single machine. His methodical approach to unfamiliar aircraft had kept him alive through countless dangerous evaluation flights, but nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what he was about to discover at altitude. The massive fighter accelerated slowly, consuming nearly the entire field before lifting reluctantly into the morning sky. At 10,000 feet, climbing steadily, the P-47 felt exactly as Luftwaffe combat pilots had described in their engagement reports. Heavy, sluggish, a lumbering giant that any competent German pilot could outmaneuver in a turning fight. Lerche continued climbing. 15,000 feet. The controls still felt ponderous. 20,000 feet. Still nothing remarkable. The Focke-Wulf 190 he had flown yesterday morning felt far more responsive at this altitude. But somewhere above 25,000 feet, as the turbocharger buried deep in the rear fuselage reached optimal operating temperature, the character of the American fighter transformed completely. The engine that had seemed merely powerful at lower altitudes now produced thrust with an enthusiasm that bordered on violence. Lerche watched his instruments carefully as he climbed through 28,000 feet. The manifold pressure gauge held steady. The engine temperature remained stable. Every German fighter he had ever flown lost significant power as altitude increased. Their engines gasped for oxygen in the thin air. But this American engine, fed by the sophisticated turbocharger system forcing compressed air into the cylinders, maintained full rated output. At 30,000 feet, Lerche leveled off and advanced the throttle. The Thunderbolt accelerated with surprising vigor for such a massive aircraft. He rolled into a shallow dive to test high-speed characteristics, following standard evaluation procedures. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour. Past 450. At 480 miles per hour, Lerche began his recovery, pulling back on the control stick with moderate pressure. Then he pushed the nose down steeper, accelerating into a proper dive. 500 miles per hour, 520. The aircraft was still accelerating, 540. Lerche felt the controls stiffen as airflow compressed around the airframe. This was normal compressibility effect, documented in every high-speed fighter. He began his recovery pull, expecting the same characteristics he had experienced in Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s at these speeds. The Thunderbolt responded with control authority that shocked him. Where German fighters at this speed required both hands on the stick and considerable physical strength to overcome increasingly rigid controls, the P-47 remained responsive. The elevators still provided adequate control force. The aircraft answered his inputs with precision that should have been impossible at 540 miles per hour indicated airspeed. Lerche completed his recovery and climbed back to altitude, his engineer's mind cataloguing what he had just experienced. He needed to test this again, verify the initial observation, eliminate the possibility of instrument error or pilot perception mistake. He rolled into another dive, this time steeper. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 6,000 feet of altitude, 7,000, 8,000. The airspeed indicator passed 500 miles per hour and kept climbing. 520, 540, 560 miles per hour indicated. Lerche was approaching speeds where every German fighter he had ever flown entered dangerous compressibility regions, where control surfaces became completely ineffective and structural failure became a genuine risk. He pulled back on the stick. The Thunderbolt responded immediately. The controls were stiff, certainly, requiring firm pressure, but they remained effective. The aircraft recovered from the dive without the violent oscillations or control lockup that characterized German fighters at these speeds. When Lerche landed an hour later and shut down the massive radial engine, he sat quietly in the cockpit for several minutes, organizing his thoughts before meeting with the technical evaluation team. What he needed to tell them would contradict fundamental assumptions about high-speed flight that had guided German fighter design throughout the war. The dive speed advantage the Thunderbolt demonstrated was not merely incremental, it represented a categorical difference in capability that explained combat reports Luftwaffe intelligence officers had been struggling to understand for months. German fighter pilots across multiple fronts had reported American P-47s executing diving attacks at speeds that seemed impossible. They described Thunderbolts disengaging from combat by simply pushing their noses down and accelerating to velocities where German fighters could not follow. Pursuit aircraft attempting to chase diving P-47s encountered severe compressibility effects. Controls locked up. Aircraft began buffeting violently. Some pilots who pressed pursuit too aggressively never recovered, their fighters breaking apart under aerodynamic loads or crashing when they could not pull out of the dive. The Americans, somehow, had built a fighter that could safely exceed dive speeds where German aircraft encountered critical limitations. Lerche's initial evaluation flight confirmed what Luftwaffe intelligence had feared. This was not pilot exaggeration or combat stress affecting perception. The P-47 genuinely possessed dive performance that exceeded any fighter in German service. Understanding how the Americans achieved this capability would require detailed technical analysis. The captured Thunderbolt had arrived at Rechlin 3 months earlier, in January 1944, after Second Lieutenant William E. Roach of the 358th Fighter Squadron mistakenly landed at Carpix Airfield in occupied France on November 7, 1943. Roach had been returning from a combat mission when brutal headwinds over the English Channel consumed fuel at an alarming rate. His gauges showed near-empty tanks. England lay ahead, tantalizingly close but impossibly far given his fuel situation. The French countryside below included numerous airfields. One looked remarkably similar to Allied bases he knew. Roach committed to his approach and landed smoothly. Only after following a ground vehicle to the parking area and shutting down his engine did Roach notice the Balkenkreuz markings on nearby aircraft. German soldiers surrounded his cockpit with rifles drawn within minutes. His war as a combat pilot ended at that moment. But the education of the Luftwaffe was about to begin in ways neither side anticipated. Local Luftwaffe personnel immediately recognized the intelligence value. Within hours, the Thunderbolt was surrounded by armed guards. American markings were painted over with German national insignia. Bright yellow identification paint was applied to undersurfaces and tail surfaces, according to standard RLM-04 specifications used for all captured aircraft. The aircraft received temporary designation and was quickly transported to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's premier testing facility located approximately 100 kilometers northwest of Berlin. Rechlin represented the absolute pinnacle of German aviation research infrastructure. The facility included extensive workshops, wind tunnels, static test equipment, high-speed photography installations, and instrumentation systems for measuring every conceivable aircraft performance parameter. Engineers and technicians assigned to Rechlin were the finest aviation specialists Germany possessed. If anyone could extract the secrets of American fighter design, it would be these men working in these facilities. The P-47 arrived at Rechlin accompanied by unusual urgency from Luftwaffe High Command. Standard procedure called for methodical evaluation of captured aircraft according to established protocols. Testing would normally proceed deliberately over weeks or months. But intelligence officers reviewing combat reports from the Western Front had identified patterns suggesting American fighters possessed capabilities that combat pilots could not adequately explain. Thunderbolts consistently escaped from engagements by diving away at speeds German fighters could not match. Damaged P-47s routinely returned to base with battle damage that would have destroyed any German fighter. American pilots demonstrated confidence in their aircraft's high-altitude performance that allowed them to refuse combat at medium altitudes where German fighters held advantage. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring personally issued orders that the captured Thunderbolt receive priority evaluation. Specific emphasis was placed on understanding its high-altitude performance, dive speed characteristics, and structural strength. The orders reflected growing concern at the highest levels of Luftwaffe command that American fighters were not merely equivalent to German designs, they might actually be superior in specific crucial ways that were enabling American air superiority over Germany. Hans-Werner Lerche was the obvious choice for initial evaluation flights. At 30 years old in 1944, Lerche had already established himself as perhaps the finest test pilot in German service. His background combined formal aeronautical engineering education with exceptional flying skill and an almost supernatural ability to understand aircraft behavior. More importantly, Lerche possessed the rare combination of technical expertise and survival instinct that kept test pilots alive when evaluating unfamiliar, potentially dangerous aircraft. His approach to the captured P-47 demonstrated this methodical discipline. Before attempting flight, Lerche spent hours examining the cockpit, identifying every control and instrument, inferring the function of systems through careful observation. The instrument panel contained approximately twice as many gauges as German fighters. Strange levers controlled systems Lerche had never encountered in German designs. The turbocharger required understanding exhaust flow management principles that were theoretical in German aviation, but apparently standard practice in American aircraft. The constant speed propeller operated differently from German equivalents. Most confusing was the elaborate system of automatic engine management. German pilots handled mixture control, propeller pitch, and throttle adjustments manually through constant attention. The American system apparently automated these functions to a degree that seemed almost excessive. Lerche wrote in his logbook after his initial cockpit familiarization, "The P-47 could baffle even an experienced pilot. I gradually managed to ascertain the function of most levers and instruments, but there were also some obscure controls, the meaning of which was not immediately clear to me." The engine start sequence alone revealed sophistication beyond standard German practice. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 required specific procedures to properly initialize the turbocharger system. Lerche followed the process methodically, his engineer's mind cataloging each step. When the 18-cylinder radial engine roared to life, it produced sound utterly different from German engines. This was deep, powerful rumble that spoke of enormous displacement and tremendous power reserves. That first takeoff had been nerve-wracking, despite Lerche's experience. The P-47 weighed nearly 10,000 pounds empty. This example carried substantial fuel and full ammunition load, bringing loaded weight to approximately 13,500 pounds. For comparison, the Focke-Wulf 190A-8 that Lerche had flown extensively weighed approximately 7,650 pounds empty and roughly 10,800 pounds fully loaded. The Thunderbolt was genuinely massive for a single-seat fighter. The takeoff run consumed nearly the entire grass field. But once airborne and climbing steadily through 10,000 feet, Lerche began noticing details that contradicted his initial impressions. The aircraft's handling qualities, while certainly different from German fighters, showed careful engineering attention. Control forces were well balanced. The aircraft flew stable hands-off flight once trimmed. Visibility from the cockpit was excellent, better than most German fighters. The Americans had clearly invested substantial effort in making this large aircraft manageable for average pilots. But the revelation came at altitude. That first dive from 30,000 feet had demonstrated performance that Lerche initially struggled to believe. He verified his instruments 3 times before accepting what they indicated. The P-47 had exceeded 540 miles per hour, indicated airspeed, while maintaining adequate control authority for safe recovery. No German fighter in operational service could match this performance. The Focke-Wulf 190 encountered severe compressibility effects beyond approximately 450 miles per hour indicated. The Messerschmitt 109 faced similar limitations with additional control difficulties at high speeds. Lerche had personally evaluated most German fighter types in service. He knew their limitations intimately. The Americans had somehow designed and built a fighter that could safely dive faster than any German fighter and recover with control authority that should have been impossible at these speeds. After landing from his evaluation flights, Lerche met with the technical assessment team led by Oberingenieur Dippel-Ing Franz Rossner, Chief of Fighter Evaluation at Rechlin. The meeting included representatives from the Luftwaffe Technical Office, intelligence officers from Luftwaffe High Command, and senior engineers from Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt, who had been summoned specifically to observe American design approaches. Lerche's report was direct and professionally devastating. The P-47 Thunderbolt demonstrates dive performance that substantially exceeds any fighter currently in Luftwaffe service. At speeds approaching and exceeding 540 miles per hour indicated airspeed, where our fighters encounter critical compressibility effects and loss of control authority, the Thunderbolt maintains adequate elevator effectiveness for safe recovery. The aircraft can achieve these speeds in relatively shallow dives from altitude and sustain them longer than our fighters before control difficulties emerge. He paused, watching the engineers absorb this information. Furthermore, the turbocharger system provides engine performance at 30,000 feet that equals or exceeds sea-level power output. Climb performance at high altitude is superior to all German fighters I have evaluated. The combination of high-altitude engine performance and exceptional dive speed creates tactical capabilities that explain combat reports we have been receiving from operational units. Franz Rossner asked the critical question: can you estimate the practical tactical advantage this dive performance provides to American pilots in combat? Lerche considered carefully before responding. If an American pilot maintains altitude discipline, operating above 25,000 feet where his engine performance is superior, he can attack any target below him with near impunity. He dives at speeds where our fighters cannot effectively follow. He delivers his attack and recovers to altitude using kinetic energy from the dive. If engaged by our fighters, he simply dives away at speeds we cannot match. Attempting to pursue him into a high-speed dive places our pilots in severe danger from compressibility effects that the American aircraft handles far better. The silence in the briefing room lasted several seconds. Everyone present understood the implications. German fighter tactics since the Spanish Civil War had emphasized superior pilot skill, aggressive maneuvering, and tactical innovation. But if the Americans possessed an aircraft that could refuse engagement at German fighters' best altitudes and attack with impunity from above, pilot skill became less relevant than physics. One of the Messerschmitt engineers spoke carefully. Are we certain this is not simply superior pilot technique? Perhaps their pilots have discovered recovery procedures from high-speed dives that our pilots have not developed? Lerche shook his head. I am a test pilot with extensive experience in high-speed flight evaluation. I used optimal recovery technique in the American aircraft. The difference is in the airframe design, not pilot technique. Their fighter maintains control authority at speeds where ours lose effectiveness. This is fundamental aerodynamic design, not operational procedure. The implications spread rapidly through Luftwaffe technical services and operational commands over the following weeks. Combat reports were reviewed with new understanding. German fighter pilots had been reporting for months that P-47s consistently escaped engagement by diving away. Initially, this was interpreted as American reluctance to fight, as cowardice or poor pilot quality. Now it became clear that American pilots were following tactical doctrine that exploited their aircraft's genuine performance advantages. German fighters, climbing to intercept bomber formations at 25,000 feet or higher, were operating at altitudes where their engines produced perhaps 70% of sea-level power. The P-47 escorts maintained full power output. German fighters attempting to climb above the Americans found themselves outperformed. The Thunderbolts could climb higher, faster, maintaining energy advantage. When combat developed, American pilots could choose whether to engage based on tactical advantage. If German fighters threatened from below, P-47 pilots simply maintained altitude. If German fighters somehow achieved altitude advantage, American pilots dove away at speeds German pilots could not safely match. The tactical problem facing Luftwaffe fighter units was becoming clear. They were being asked to defend German airspace against bomber formations, escorted by fighters that possessed fundamental performance advantages at the altitudes where combat occurred. Superior German pilot skill and aggressive tactics could achieve local victories, but systematic application of American material advantage was producing strategic air superiority despite German tactical excellence. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The detailed technical evaluation of the captured Thunderbolt proceeded according to standard Rechlin methodology over the following weeks. Engineers photographed every component from multiple angles. They measured every dimension with precision instruments. They weighed major assemblies. They tested systems under various conditions. The goal was comprehensive understanding of American design philosophy and manufacturing capability. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine received special attention. German engineers had access to intelligence reports describing American radial engines, but examining an actual example in detail revealed capabilities that shocked specialists accustomed to resource-constrained German production. The engine consisted of 18 cylinders, arranged in 2 rows of 9 cylinders, each around a central crankshaft. Total displacement measured 2,845 cubic inches, equivalent to 45.958 litres. For comparison, the BMW 801D that powered the Focke-Wulf 190 displaced 2,560 cubic inches, or 41.88 litres, but displacement alone did not explain the significant power difference. The R2800 incorporated forged aluminum alloy pistons manufactured to tolerances that impressed German engineers. Sodium-cooled exhaust valves handled extreme temperatures. The crankshaft was forged from high-grade steel alloy that German metallurgists examined with professional envy, immediately recognizing materials they could no longer obtain in sufficient quantities due to strategic shortages. Every component showed evidence of precision manufacturing. Surface finishes were consistently smooth across all parts. The magnetos used materials that were increasingly scarce in Germany. Spark plugs incorporated high-grade ceramics superior to German equivalents. The fuel injection system operated with precision that German engineers associated with laboratory equipment rather than combat aircraft expected to function reliably under harsh field conditions. Most significantly, the entire engine showed no signs of material substitution or quality compromises forced by resource limitations. The Americans had built this engine exactly as originally designed, using all specified materials without the desperate improvisations that increasingly characterized German production. One of the examining engineers wrote in his technical report, "The workmanship and material quality evident in this American engine exceeds current German production standards. Every component appears to be manufactured from optimal materials without compromise. This level of production fidelity to engineering specifications represents manufacturing capacity and resource availability that Germany no longer possesses." The turbocharger system revealed engineering sophistication that Germany had attempted to develop but never successfully implemented in production fighters. Exhaust gases from all 18 cylinders were collected through manifolds and routed through insulated pipes, running along both sides of the fuselage, to a turbine unit located behind and below the cockpit. This turbine, spinning at tremendous speed driven by hot exhaust gases, powered a centrifugal compressor that forced additional air into the engine's supercharger. The system included an intercooler to reduce compressed air temperature, thereby increasing density and preventing destructive detonation. Automatic regulators controlled boost pressure and turbine speed without requiring constant pilot intervention beyond setting desired manifold pressure. German engineers understood the theoretical principles perfectly. Experimental programs had explored similar approaches. But implementing such systems in mass-produced combat aircraft had proven impossible given material shortages and manufacturing limitations plaguing German industry by 1944. The turbocharger required exotic high-temperature alloys for turbine blades that had to withstand extreme temperatures while spinning at high speeds. The control system demanded precision manufacturing and reliable components. Extensive ducting needed heat-resistant materials and perfect seals to function efficiently. Every element had to work reliably in combat conditions, exposed to vibration, temperature extremes ranging from -60 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude to over 200 degrees near the engine, and potential battle damage. The Americans had solved all these problems and installed the complete system as standard equipment on every P-47 produced. This was not experimental equipment reserved for special missions or limited production runs. It was simply how the airplane worked, installed in thousands of examples rolling off Republic aviation production lines. German technical reports from Rechlin evaluation noted that the turbocharger system alone represented a level of engineering sophistication and manufacturing capability that exceeded current German capacity to replicate in production quantities. But perhaps the most profound insight came not from any single advanced system, but from examining the cumulative design philosophy evident throughout the aircraft. The Americans had designed the P-47 to accomplish a specific mission, escorting heavy bombers deep into German airspace at altitudes above 25,000 feet. Every design decision supported this mission requirement. The massive engine provided power at altitude. The turbocharger maintained that power in thin air. Heavy armor protected the pilot during extended operations in hostile airspace. 8 machine guns provided overwhelming firepower. Self-sealing fuel tanks and robust structure allowed the aircraft to absorb battle damage and return home. The dive speed capability, which Lerche had discovered during his evaluation flights, resulted directly from fundamental structural design decisions. The P-47's thick wing section, which made it a poor turner compared to thin-winged German fighters, actually delayed the onset of critical compressibility effects. The wing root was massively strong, designed to withstand loads exceeding 8G positive. The control surfaces were sized and balanced to remain effective at high speeds. Even the tail surfaces showed unusual strength, capable of handling aerodynamic loads that would damage lighter structures. American engineers had apparently anticipated that combat pilots would dive their fighters at maximum speed when necessary. They designed the airframe to handle these loads safely. German fighters, designed primarily for maneuverability and optimized for combat at medium altitudes, sacrificed high-speed dive capability. The design priorities reflected different tactical assumptions about how air combat would develop. Franz Rossner's comprehensive technical evaluation report, completed in May 1944 and distributed through Luftwaffe technical office channels, emphasized these philosophical differences. The American P-47 represents a complete system optimized for high-altitude bomber escort missions. Performance at medium and low altitudes is deliberately sacrificed to achieve superiority above 25,000 feet. Dive speed, capability, and structural strength allow the aircraft to engage and disengage at will when operating from altitude advantage. The cumulative effect creates an aircraft that dominates combat in its design envelope while accepting inferiority in other flight regimes. The report concluded with an assessment that troubled Luftwaffe leadership. Replicating this aircraft's capabilities would require access to strategic materials, manufacturing precision, and production capacity that Germany no longer possesses. Understanding American design philosophy provides intelligence value, but offers no practical path to matching their capabilities given current industrial constraints. The evaluation program at Rechlin continued through the spring and summer of 1944 as additional captured P-47s arrived for testing. On May 29, 1944, Second Lieutenant Lloyd S. Hathcock of the 302nd Fighter Squadron, 332nd Fighter Group, became disoriented during a ferry flight and mistakenly landed at the enemy-held Rome Littorio airfield in Italy. His aircraft, serial number 42-75971, was quickly seized by German forces and transported to Rechlin for evaluation. This particular P-47 had previously been the personal mount of George Novotny, an 8 Victory ace flying with the 317th Fighter Squadron. The Germans designated it T9 plus LK after transfer to the Circus Rosarius Evaluation Unit. Having multiple examples of the Thunderbolt, allowed engineers to verify that the performance characteristics Lerche had discovered were consistent across production aircraft, not anomalies of a single example. Every P-47 tested demonstrated the same exceptional dive speed capability. Every example showed the same high-altitude engine performance. Every aircraft displayed similar structural strength and damage tolerance. The Americans were producing these capabilities consistently, in quantity, as standard production equipment. This consistency across multiple captured examples eliminated any hope that the Thunderbolt's advantages resulted from specially modified evaluation aircraft or pre-production prototypes. The tactical implications were systematically analyzed and distributed to operational fighter units through a series of briefings and technical bulletins. Luftwaffe fighter pilots needed to understand what they were facing and develop countermeasures where possible. The recommendations compiled from Rechlin testing were professionally realistic but strategically discouraging. Fighter pilots were advised that engaging P-47s below 15,000 feet offered the best probability of success. At these lower altitudes, the Thunderbolt's poor rate of climb and ponderous handling gave German fighters clear advantages in maneuverability. But American pilots, following proper doctrine, rarely descended to these altitudes voluntarily. They maintained altitude advantage where their aircraft's strengths dominated. Pilots were specifically warned never to follow diving Thunderbolts. The briefing documents were explicit about this danger. Attempting to pursue a P-47 in a dive would place German pilots in severe danger from compressibility effects that the American fighter handled far better. Multiple Luftwaffe pilots had already been killed attempting such pursuits, their aircraft breaking apart under aerodynamic loads or crashing when they could not recover from high-speed dives. The tactical guidance emphasized that damaged P-47s frequently continued flying despite battle damage that would destroy German fighters. Attacks needed to be pressed aggressively with concentrated fire rather than assuming a few hits would down the aircraft. This advice reflected frustrating combat experience. Luftwaffe pilots had repeatedly reported hitting Thunderbolts with cannon fire, seeing strikes, assuming kills, only to watch the American fighters continue flying and escape. But tactical advice, however useful to individual pilots, could not address the fundamental strategic problem that became increasingly apparent throughout 1944. Germany was fighting an opponent with effectively unlimited material resources relative to German industrial capacity. Every damaged or destroyed P-47 was replaced within days from production exceeding 300 aircraft per month at peak output. American pilot training programs produced adequately skilled aviators in quantities Germany could no longer match, as training was compressed and fuel shortages limited flight hours. The captured P-47s were eventually transferred to the Sonderstaffel Rosarius, the special Luftwaffe demonstration unit commanded by Theodor Rosarius. This specialized unit traveled to frontline fighter bases throughout occupied Europe, allowing German pilots to see captured Allied aircraft firsthand and learn recognition features, performance characteristics, and tactical vulnerabilities where they existed. The demonstrations served dual purposes, both educational and psychological. Pilots learned visual recognition features to identify enemy aircraft in the critical first seconds of engagement. They observed flight characteristics and performance limitations, but they also confronted physical evidence that Allied equipment was often superior to their own in specific important capabilities, particularly at high altitudes, where combat increasingly occurred. Hans-Werner Lerche frequently flew the captured Thunderbolts during these demonstrations. His presentations to frontline fighter squadrons followed a consistent format. He would first demonstrate the P-47's characteristics at medium altitudes, around 10,000 to 15,000 feet, where it appeared sluggish and unimpressive. German pilots watching from the ground would see an aircraft that seemed to validate their assumptions about American inferiority. Then Lerche would climb to altitude and demonstrate what the Thunderbolt could do above 25,000 feet. He would execute high-speed dives that German fighters could not match. He would zoom climb back to altitude using kinetic energy. He would demonstrate the roll rate that made the P-47 surprisingly effective despite its weight. The watching pilots' expressions would shift from confidence to concern as they realized what American pilots flying these aircraft could achieve when using proper tactics. After landing, Lerche would brief the pilots on recommended countermeasures. Never allow the American fighters to maintain altitude advantage. Force them down to medium altitudes where German fighters held maneuverability advantage. Attack bomber formations quickly from lower altitudes and escape before P-47 escorts could dive on you. If a Thunderbolt dives on you from above, brake hard perpendicular to his attack angle, making him overshoot, then dive away yourself before he can recover and attack again. These were sound tactical recommendations based on thorough analysis, but they all assumed German pilots could somehow dictate the terms of engagement. In practice, American fighters operating from altitude advantage could choose whether to engage. If conditions were unfavorable, they simply maintained position above the bombers, refusing combat until German fighters were forced by fuel limitations to break off or descend. Post-war interviews with Luftwaffe pilots who attended these demonstrations revealed the psychological impact. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, who commanded Jagdgeschwader 77 and survived the war with 176 victories, later described a demonstration he attended in June 1944. Lerche flew the American Thunderbolt through maneuvers that seemed impossible for such a large aircraft. When he dove from altitude, the speed was simply terrifying. Our fighters could not come close to matching this performance. Then he explained that American pilots had hundreds of these aircraft, that they were being produced faster than we could destroy them, and that their pilots were trained specifically to exploit these advantages. Steinhoff paused in his recollection before continuing. I realized at that moment we were not fighting a war of skill against skill. We were fighting industrial capacity against courage, and industrial capacity was winning. The demonstrations continued through the summer of 1944, but by then the strategic situation had deteriorated to where tactical intelligence provided little practical value. The Normandy invasion succeeded in June. Allied armies advanced across France. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots in unsustainable numbers. Gerhard Barkhorn, who survived the war as the second highest-scoring ace in aviation history with 301 victories, most achieved on the Eastern Front, had later reflected on the impossible situation facing German fighter pilots in 1944. We understood clearly that American equipment was superior in important ways. We had detailed technical data on Allied aircraft performance from captured examples tested at Rechlin, but knowledge could not produce the fuel, the replacement aircraft, the trained pilots, or the time we needed. The dive speed advantage demonstrated by the P-47 became a symbol of this broader industrial superiority. German engineers could measure it precisely, test pilots could experience it directly, combat pilots could observe it in every engagement, but Germany could not replicate it. The thick wing sections that delayed compressibility effects required sophisticated aerodynamic analysis and wind tunnel testing to design properly. The structural strength needed to handle high-speed dives required high-grade aluminum alloys and precision manufacturing. The powerful engine and turbocharger system required materials and production capabilities that were becoming increasingly scarce. Even if Germany somehow developed equivalent technology, producing it in meaningful quantities was impossible by 1944. Allied strategic bombing had systematically destroyed German industrial capacity. Ball-bearing factories that produced precision components were bombed repeatedly. Aluminum refineries operated at reduced capacity due to power shortages. Transportation networks were degraded by continuous air attack, making it difficult to move materials between factories. Skilled workers had been conscripted into military service or killed, replaced by forced labor with minimal training and little motivation. The comparison between American and German production illustrated the impossible strategic situation. Republic Aviation alone produced 15,683 P-47s during the war. This single American factory's output approached Germany's total single-engine fighter production across all manufacturers. When combined with P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, and other fighter types, American production exceeded 70,000 fighters while simultaneously producing tens of thousands of bombers, transport aircraft, and trainers. Germany's total aircraft production for 1944 reached approximately 39,800 aircraft of all types, including trainers, transports, and bombers. Fighter production was approximately 25,600 aircraft. But these numbers masked severe quality problems, as manufacturing standards degraded under pressure. Late-war German fighters increasingly suffered from poor workmanship, substitute materials of inferior quality, and inadequate quality control as experienced workers were replaced and factories operated under constant threat of bombing. The Americans, meanwhile, maintained and improved quality while expanding production. Late-war P-47s incorporated refinements based on combat experience. The P-47D-30 variant featured a bubble canopy, providing 360-degree visibility. The P-47N extended range with larger internal fuel tanks. The P-47M achieved 2,800 horsepower, making it among the most powerful piston fighters ever built. Each improvement was implemented across hundreds or thousands of production aircraft. Hans Werner Lerche continued flying captured Allied aircraft throughout 1944 and into 1945, compiling one of the most remarkable test pilot records in aviation history. He evaluated 125 different aircraft types without ever crashing or seriously damaging a single example. His professional objectivity and technical expertise made his reports valuable intelligence resources. But even Lerche recognized by late 1944 that intelligence gathering had become an academic exercise with little operational relevance. In December 1944, Lerche participated in evaluating a captured P-51D Mustang, the long-range escort fighter that was replacing Thunderbolts in many bomber escort roles. His assessment was brief and professionally devastating. The P-51 combines high-altitude performance comparable to the P-47 with superior range and maneuverability. At all altitudes above 20,000 feet, this aircraft is superior to every German fighter in operational service. Below 20,000 feet, it remains competitive with our best fighters. We have no aircraft in production or development that can match its overall capabilities. The captured Thunderbolts served until the final chaotic months of the war. T-9 plus FK, originally William Roach's aircraft nicknamed Beetle, was recovered by American forces at Göttingen in May 1945. Photographs taken by American soldiers show the aircraft still wearing partial German markings, parked alongside Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, in what had become essentially a museum documenting Luftwaffe intelligence gathering efforts. T-9 plus LK, Lloyd Hathcock's former aircraft, met similar fate, recovered but not preserved. After evaluation by American intelligence teams examining German testing procedures, both aircraft were eventually scrapped. Their historical significance was not yet fully recognized. Thousands of P-47s remained in service, and preservation resources focused on rarer types. The pilots whose aircraft had been captured followed very different paths. William Roach spent the remainder of the war at Stalag Luft 1 in Bath, Germany, a prisoner of war camp specifically for captured Allied airmen. He was liberated by Soviet forces in May 1945 and returned to the United States. He survived the war and lived for decades afterward, occasionally reflecting on the moment he mistakenly landed at a German airfield and unknowingly handed the Luftwaffe one of their most valuable intelligence prizes. Lloyd Hathcock spent 11 months as a prisoner of war, primarily at Stalag Luft 3, the site of the famous Great Escape that had occurred just 3 months before his arrival. He was the only African-American pilot among thousands of white prisoners at the camp. When Soviet forces advanced westward in January 1945, German guards forced prisoners on a brutal winter march to Stalag 7A and then Stalag 13D. Hathcock was liberated by Allied forces in April 1945. He returned to the United States and played a significant role in the post-war desegregation of the U.S. Air Force, which occurred in 1948. He later pioneered innovations in aerial reconnaissance photography at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, applying technical expertise developed during the war to peacetime applications. He passed away in 1991, honored as one of the Tuskegee Airmen who had fought with distinction despite facing discrimination from their own military. Hans Werner Lerche survived the war despite flying 125 different aircraft types under often dangerous conditions. His remarkable safety record stands unique in aviation history. After the war, he provided extensive debriefings to Allied intelligence services about German aircraft development programs. His memoirs, published in 1977 in German and translated into English in 1980 as Luftwaffe Test Pilot, Flying Captured Allied Aircraft of World War II, provide detailed first-hand accounts of the German captured aircraft evaluation program. The book offers valuable insights into how the Luftwaffe assessed Allied aviation technology and reveals the professional respect German engineers and pilots developed for American aircraft design and manufacturing capability. Lerche passed away in 1997 at age 83, having lived long enough to see jet aviation evolve through multiple generations and vindicate many of the high-speed flight principles he had explored in captured Thunderbolts over Germany. The broader strategic lessons from the captured P-47 evaluations extended far beyond immediate tactical intelligence. The Thunderbolt demonstrated that by 1943 and 1944, the outcome of the air war over Europe was being determined not by pilot skill, tactical innovation, or even narrow technical superiority in specific aircraft parameters. Industrial capacity applied at national scale had become the decisive factor. The nation that could design adequate equipment and produce it in overwhelming quantities, while simultaneously supporting massive ground forces and strategic bombing campaigns, would inevitably defeat opponents who produced technically sophisticated equipment in insufficient numbers. Germany's situation by late 1943 was attempting to compete industrially against opponents whose combined capacity exceeded German resources by factors of 5 or more. When Britain refused to surrender after France fell in June 1940, when the Soviet Union survived the initial German onslaught and relocated its industry beyond German reach, and when the United States entered the war with its vast, untouched industrial base, Germany's path to military victory effectively closed. The only remaining question was duration: how long Germany could continue fighting, and how much destruction would occur before the inevitable conclusion. The story of captured Thunderbolts at Rechlin thus becomes a microcosm of Germany's broader strategic dilemma. German engineers could examine American equipment with professional thoroughness. They could understand American capabilities with technical precision. They could accurately assess American industrial strength with brutal honesty. Knowledge was professionally gathered, carefully analyzed, thoroughly documented, and widely distributed through proper channels. But knowledge alone could not produce the aluminum, steel, rubber, fuel, machine tools, skilled workers, undamaged factories, and functioning transportation networks required to compete with American production. The dive speed advantage that Hans Werner Lerche discovered during his evaluation flights represented more than an interesting technical characteristic. It symbolized systematic American advantages across multiple dimensions. The thick wing design that delayed compressibility effects required sophisticated aerodynamic analysis. The structural strength to handle high-speed dives demanded quality materials and precision manufacturing. The powerful engine and turbocharger needed resources and production capacity. The combat doctrine exploiting these advantages required confident pilots and adequate training. The logistics supporting operations provided fuel and ammunition without apparent constraint. Every element functioned as part of a complete system, optimized for achieving air superiority over Germany at high altitude. German forces could identify each individual advantage, but they faced all of them simultaneously, supported by industrial capacity that exceeded German resources by overwhelming margins. Technical reports from Rechlin were models of professional analysis. They identified American strengths with precision. They recommended countermeasures where possible. They honestly assessed what could and could not be replicated given German industrial limitations. But the reports also implicitly documented the dimensions of German strategic failure. Germany had entered the war with arguably the world's most advanced air force. German pilots were better trained than most opponents initially. German tactics were more refined. German aircraft were generally superior on a one-to-one basis. These advantages sustained early victories against opponents with similar resource constraints. But against the combined industrial might of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, technical excellence and tactical skill could only delay the inevitable outcome, not change it. The final historical irony was that the Germans learned these lessons thoroughly, understood the implications completely, and documented everything professionally, yet could never apply the knowledge. Understanding American industrial superiority did not grant Germany the resources to match it. Knowing the P-47's exact capabilities did not provide the means to produce equivalent aircraft in equivalent quantities. Intelligence gathered from captured aircraft documented German defeat with scientific precision, while offering no realistic path to avoid that defeat. When Allied forces captured Rechlin and associated facilities in May 1945, they found extensive documentation of captured aircraft evaluation programs. German technical reports filled filing cabinets, detailing every measurable characteristic of American and British aircraft examined during the war. The reports demonstrated thorough engineering competence and scientific objectivity. They also represented thousands of man-hours spent meticulously documenting capabilities that Germany could observe and measure but never replicate given deteriorating industrial conditions. American technical intelligence teams who reviewed German reports after the war noted that German engineers had understood American aircraft capabilities more clearly than American commanders sometimes did. Germans had identified weaknesses in American designs that American pilots learned to work around through experience. Technical analysis was frequently more detailed than equivalent American evaluations of their own equipment. German engineering competence had never been in question. But American reviewers also noted what German reports implicitly revealed about Germany's strategic position. Germany had attempted to fight a modern industrial war with an industrial base insufficient for the task. They compensated through excellent engineering, superior pilot training in early war years, and tactical innovation born of necessity. These advantages sustained them through initial victories, but against an opponent like the United States, possessing industrial capacity exceeding all other major powers combined, technical excellence could only delay defeat, not prevent it. The story of German pilots and engineers examining captured P-47s provides clear case study in realities of industrial warfare as it evolved during World War II. The Thunderbolt succeeded not because it was the absolute best possible fighter by every conceivable measure. It succeeded because it was a very effective fighter produced in quantities that made isolated technical superiority strategically irrelevant. Republic Aviation built 15,683 Thunderbolts, while simultaneously American industry produced 15,486 P-51 Mustangs, 10,370 P-38 Lightnings, and tens of thousands of other aircraft types. Each aircraft represented thousands of hours of skilled labor, tons of aluminum and steel, hundreds of precision components, and manufacturing capacity Germany could not approach. The P-47 became a symbol of American industrial dominance to German pilots who fought against it and German engineers who examined it. They measured its capabilities precisely, they documented its advantages professionally, they reported findings accurately through command channels. The lesson arrived too late to matter strategically. By the time William Roach's Thunderbolt was being examined at Rechlin in late 1943, the war's outcome was already determined by industrial mathematics that no amount of German engineering skill or pilot courage could overcome. Hans-Werner Lerche's discovery of the P-47's exceptional dive speed during his April 1944 evaluation flights revealed a capability that explained months of confusing combat reports. German fighter pilots had been reporting that Thunderbolts escaped engagement by diving away at speeds that seemed impossible. The reports were accurate. The Americans had built a fighter that could safely exceed dive speeds where German aircraft encountered critical limitations. This advantage resulted from systematic design decisions, from sophisticated engineering analysis, from quality materials consistently applied, from manufacturing precision maintained across thousands of production aircraft. It represented American industrial philosophy, prioritizing absolute capability over elegant efficiency, abundant resources over careful optimization, systematic material advantage over individual technical brilliance. These priorities, implemented with nearly unlimited resources and manufacturing capacity, produced weapons systems that outclassed German equivalents in aggregate, even when German designs showed superior characteristics in specific isolated parameters. The dive speed advantage alone did not win the air war over Europe, but it exemplified the cumulative advantages that made American victory inevitable once industrial capacity was fully mobilized. German pilots who encountered diving thunderbolts faced an opponent who could engage when conditions favored him and escape when they did not. Superior German pilot skill became less relevant when the enemy could refuse unfavorable engagement. The broader lesson that emerges from captured P-47 evaluations transcends specific technical details. By 1943 and 1944, modern warfare had evolved to where industrial capacity systematically applied through competent engineering and adequate tactical execution would defeat technical excellence constrained by resource scarcity. The most powerful element in America's arsenal was not any individual weapon, however capable. It was the complete industrial system that could conceive, design, develop, test, produce, and logistically support thousands of complex weapons systems simultaneously, while maintaining quality and continuously improving designs based on combat experience. The captured Thunderbolts taught this lesson with undeniable clarity. German engineers measured it precisely. Test pilots experienced it directly. Combat pilots observed it in every engagement. Intelligence officers documented it professionally. The lesson was reported accurately through command channels, but it arrived too late to matter. By April 1944, when Hans-Werner Lerche discovered the P-47's dive speed advantage during systematic evaluation flights, Germany's strategic defeat was already inevitable. The Thunderbolts, sitting on German airfields wearing hasty Balkenkreuz markings over American stars, represented a future that had already arrived. Industrial capacity had become the decisive factor in modern warfare. Nations possessing vast manufacturing resources, abundant raw materials, and efficient logistics would defeat opponents relying on technical innovation constrained by scarcity. The P-47 demonstrated this truth with exceptional clarity because its advantages resulted directly from American industrial abundance. The thick wings that delayed compressibility required extensive research and development. The powerful engine demanded quality materials. The turbocharger system needed precision manufacturing. The robust structure used aluminum and steel without compromise. The comprehensive systems integration assumed adequate resources for optimal design. Every characteristic reflected an engineering approach possible only when supported by effectively unlimited industrial capacity. German responses to these advantages reveal the impossibility of their strategic position. They understood American capabilities thoroughly. They developed sound tactical countermeasures where possible. They fought with skill and courage, but they could not produce equivalent aircraft in sufficient numbers. They could not train replacement pilots adequately, as fuel became scarce. They could not maintain manufacturing quality, as resources dwindled. They could not prevent systematic degradation of their air force, despite knowing exactly what was happening and why. The final months of the war saw German engineers and pilots still analyzing captured American aircraft with professional diligence even as their nation collapsed. Rechlin continued evaluation programs into early 1945. Technical reports were filed properly through the end. The professionalism never wavered, but it had become an academic exercise documenting defeat rather than intelligence gathering supporting operations. The Thunderbolts that German test pilots flew with such interest and concern represented not just individual aircraft but an entire industrial system. Behind each P-47 stood American factories producing aluminum at rates exceeding Germany's total capacity, steel mills operating continuously, machine tool manufacturers supplying precision equipment, transportation networks moving materials efficiently, training programs producing adequately skilled pilots in overwhelming numbers, logistics systems delivering fuel and ammunition without apparent limitation. Germany faced this complete system with industrial capacity progressively degraded by strategic bombing, resource shortages, transportation disruption, and manpower constraints. Technical knowledge could not bridge this gap. Understanding dive speed advantages did not produce high-temperature alloys for turbocharger turbines. Recognizing structural strength requirements did not provide aluminum for airframes. Documenting engine performance did not create precision manufacturing equipment. The knowledge was accurate, thorough, professionally compiled, and strategically irrelevant. Hans Werner Lerche's evaluation flights in April 1944 revealed truths the Luftwaffe needed desperately but could never effectively apply. The P-47 could dive faster than German fighters and recover safely. This capability allowed American pilots to engage and disengage at will when operating from altitude. It explained combat results that had puzzled German intelligence for months. It validated American tactical doctrine, emphasizing vertical maneuvers over horizontal turning fights. All of this was important, accurate, professionally documented, and ultimately insufficient to change outcomes determined by industrial capacity applied at strategic scale. The captured Thunderbolts served their purpose as intelligence sources. They educated German pilots about enemy capabilities. They revealed American design philosophy. They demonstrated manufacturing quality. They proved that combat reports of impossible dive speeds were accurate, not exaggerated. But they also proved something more profound and more discouraging. American industrial supremacy was real, measurable, and insurmountable given Germany's deteriorating situation. The war would end not because German pilots lacked courage or engineers lacked skill, but because industrial mathematics favored the Allies by overwhelming margins that courage and skill could not overcome. When the war ended in May 1945, thousands of P-47s remained in American service. Republic Aviation's production lines had delivered 15,683 examples. Many continued flying for years afterward. Some were transferred to Allied nations, some were converted to racing aircraft, their dive speed capabilities finding new application in peacetime competition. The typeset, multiple speed records in post-war years, validating in sport what had been demonstrated in combat. The German evaluation program at Rechlin disappeared into history, remembered primarily through technical reports captured by Allied forces and memoirs written by participants decades later. The knowledge gathered there documented one of warfare's fundamental truths. In modern industrial conflict, adequate technology produced in overwhelming quantity defeats superior technology constrained by scarcity. The nation that can systematically apply material advantage across all dimensions of warfare will prevail against opponents relying on technical excellence and tactical skill alone. The P-47 Thunderbolt taught this lesson clearly to everyone who examined it professionally. German test pilots experienced its capabilities directly. German engineers measured its advantages precisely. German intelligence officers understood the implications completely. But understanding could not produce the industrial capacity needed to compete. The dive speed that so impressed Hans Werner Lerche during his evaluation flights symbolized advantages that could be measured and documented but never matched given Germany's strategic circumstances. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.